Bienvenidos una vez más al canal de Planeta Financiero. Mi nombre es Kaiser Pravia. Probablemente la persona que está aquí no me esté entendiendo demasiado, pero estamos con Ian Cassel, que es un inversionista que yo personalmente admiro y respeto muchísimo. De hecho, lo conocí porque en este libro que se llama Free Capital, que enseña cómo 12 personas hicieron el millón de dólares en la bolsa a través de 12 diferentes formas. Ian también contó un poco sobre su historia, ahí fue que lo conocí. Empecé a indagar en el internet, vi que tenía un club, que ahorita hablaremos sobre eso, y también vi que hacía estos eventos grandes a través de su club y pude tener la oportunidad de asistir ahorita en Las Vegas, que ya hablamos sobre eso, y bueno, también me firmó el libro, estoy muy, muy contento que esté aquí. Allá abajo vamos a tener subtítulos, obviamente, porque Ian habla en inglés, la entrevista va a ser totalmente en inglés, así que también les pido que vean la pantalla, obviamente, y que vean los subtítulos. De verdad que vamos a aportar muchísimo, muchísimo valor. Espero que no se la pierdan, que lo disfruten y que me hagan saber en los comentarios qué opinan de esta entrevista y este mundo de las empresas pequeñas. Ian, thank you for being here. How are you feeling? You're with a different community.
Yes, no, it's an honor to be with your community, and it was great to meet you in Las Vegas a couple of weeks ago. You're doing some great things there, and an honor to be on here.
Thank you, Ian, for your time. So let's start about your before launching your fund, Intelligent Fanatics Capital. You were a private investor full time. Can you tell us how how is the philosophy of going full time private investor? Because many of these the community want to go and reach that goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people would call it kind of financial independence. Other people would call it just being a full-time private investor. For me, it was just a burning desire I had ever since I was 20 years old, and I even wrote it down on a napkin, what was it, 10K and two 10 baggers or something like that, equals millionaire. I had that kind of written up there, and that was when I was 21. And it was just a passion of mine. I fell in love with the microcap space at a relatively young age, at around 21, and really, went from undergraduate into graduate studies. But the whole time I was really just focused on investing and honing this craft and doing due diligence and doing site visits and meeting with CEOs and not caring about my grades. And so I wasn't doing a lot of the things when I was getting my education that would really get me set on a career path, like doing internships and things like that. So, I just kind of buckled down, and my goal in my early 20s was just to compound my capital as quickly as possible so I could, really just become a full-time private investor. And, through some skill and some luck, was able to do that in 2009. And that was right after the global financial crisis. And
Yeah.
so from 2009 to 2019, so about a 10-year period, I was just a full-time private investor. And, it was my goal. It was my end goal. So, and it's a lot easier when you're young and you don't have a spouse or kids or responsibilities or a lot of bills. It's easier to make that decision than if you already are married and have bills and spouse, and kids and things like that. But it was a great path for me, and I learned a lot. And you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about how to control your spending. Especially given your strategy as an investor. Me, I'm a more or less a buy-in. I wouldn't say buy and forget. Never, I never say that, but kind of more of a buy and hold investor in a concentrated basket of stocks. And so, you really have to watch your spending when you're living off your capital gains, because you don't know when those gains are going to occur. You could be sitting on dead money for a year. You could be down a lot in a year, and you still have bills to pay. And so being a
Yeah.
full-time private investor, there's an emotional weight to that shouldn't be understated. And kind of looking back to, and I don't call myself a full-time private investor anymore now that I have a fund. But kind of looking back, I used to kind of push people to do what I did, but it isn't for everyone. And one of the ways I've changed or evolved is, I think it's okay to have a job, just make sure it's one that you enjoy, that
Yeah.
provides you autonomy to be able to invest at the same time. And I think you can do the same thing I did without, taking on the emotional load of, having to pay bills and, and support your family while you do it.
You mentioned two key things: control your spending, and you also mentioned the word luck. We'll get into that, but that's part of investing as well. We always speak of that in this channel. But tell us about your evolution as an investor. I'm guessing you didn't start in microcaps from the day one. Tell us about that.
I almost did. It was very close to day one, but the full story is when I was 16. So this was 1997.
Hmm.
My parents gave me approximately $20,000 that I was to use for my college education or to buy a car or whatever I wanted, but that was all I was going to be getting. They wanted me to know that before I had to make the decision on like what university I was going to go to. And they opened up a brokerage account with their financial advisor, and I put that $20,000 into that brokerage account, and I immediately were getting like emails or whatever it was, maybe it was the regular mail, but talking about small cap technology companies. And this was the dot-com bubble. It was just
Yeah.
getting into the bubble stage. And so I ended up investing in two or three of these dot-com bubble stocks that 5x'd, went up 500% over about 3 years. And so I turned that 20,000 into 100,000 very quickly by the time I graduated high school.
Yeah.
I got bit by the greed bug, and I said, I don't want to waste all this going to an expensive university. I'll just go to a cheaper university, and I'll commute from my parents' house and go, so I don't have to spend time on room and board. And I'll also have a part-time job so I can cover my tuition with that part-time job. And the part-time job was actually working for a financial advisor. And so going into undergraduate studies, that was what I was doing. And I oversaw an office for a financial advisor, and I was more or less a glorified receptionist answering phones. But when the bubble burst, my portfolio burst, and the $100,000 turned into $8,000, and I had to answer the phones of all these emotional clients that were calling, from the financial advisor where I worked, and basically my portfolio of small caps turned into microcaps, immediately, and so I kind of
Yeah.
got baptized into the microcap space, so to speak. And it was really then, so that would have been 2020, 2021, that I got interested in microcaps and focused on them. And the first company I focused on was a company called XM Satellite Radio, which now it is called Sirius Satellite Radio. And it's a, I don't know, 15 or $20 billion market cap company. Back then it was a microcap, and it was a story stock, meaning they didn't have any fundamentals. They launched, these satellites up into space to provide satellite radio, and there was really no customers. But I fell in love with the story. And so while I was in undergrad, long story short, I ended up taking a bus ride to New York City. I met the CEO of the company. My eyes
Hmm.
were as big as saucers. Like, wow, this is amazing. An idiot like me can sit across the table from a CEO. I felt like I was gaining an edge, even though I have no idea what he even told me. And I raced out of that meeting, took the $8,000 I had left, and bought his stock, XM Satellite Radio, at $1.78 per share. And almost immediately, good luck struck, and he signed up Ford, General Motors to OEM agreements, and the stock raced from $1.78 to $34 in 14 months. And I was hooked with microcap investing ever since then. And it was really the qualitative aspects of microcap investing, meaning, again, the ability of me to meet with a management team face to face, that got me hooked on it, because obviously you can't do that with larger public companies. And so that was 2021. And from
Yeah.
there, I ended up kind of staying, as regards to my evolving. I stayed in kind of the story stock realm of investing, meaning stocks that had zero fundamentals, but they had a great story. I tend to think that a lot of investors start one of two ways. They start in story stocks or value stocks, depending on when they took their first accounting course. If they got into investing after they took an accounting course, they're value investors. The first things they do is screen for cheap stocks, because that's all they know how to do. If you
Yeah.
fell in love with investing before that, you're probably a story stock investor. That's how you started because all you can understand is a story. Um, and so I got started on the story stock realm, and over the next 15 years, I then got into precious metals and resource investing, even life sciences. Um, but honestly, I didn't really start caring about profitability and fundamentals until almost the same time I became a full-time private investor. It's like I didn't start reading like Buffett's letters and things like that until I was right there at becoming a full-time private investor. And not only then did I kind of layer on fundamental analysis into everything that I learned up to that point. And so my strategy today is, it's purely me. It has, I mean, it looks like a stew or a meal where you have all the ingredients out and you're like, what's this going to be? And you put it all together and then it finally tastes good. My portfolio is a little bit like that. I have a little bit of mixture of everything in there today, from some stories, even some gold stocks, God forbid, to
Yeah.
things are represented in my portfolio today. And it's really just from this 20 years of experience.
Thank you for sharing. That was the story I got to read in this book, and it really hugged me because I read it in 2021 when the market was really going up, and I said like this guy was living the same or a similar environment 20 years ago, and I'm interested in see how he got after that. And I saw the MicroCap Club, your story, and I said like, okay, this guy knows ball, right? So yeah. Also, I feel like that in the Las Vegas event, like I was the idiot across the table with the CEOs. I felt the same, and I feel like the microcap world it's the best word for private investors if you are willing to invest time in your net worth, right? And I hope that we can convince some fellows to invest in the microcap world after this video. But before getting deep into investing, I want to ask you a question that I have seen that maybe nobody asked you before. What's your personal definition of success as a human, not as an investor?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm my best and I wrote an article about it recently on my blog. When I'm really taking care of today, across all aspects of my life, whether that's my family, whether that's kind of the business side and my portfolio. And I feel like that's the key to compounding everything in life, is just kind of focusing to living today to a high standard, doing all the things you need to do as a spouse, as a parent, as a business owner, and as a stock picker, and not pushing off those responsibilities for another day, because that's when you make a mistake, in stock picking as well. It's like we all spend way too much time, including myself, thinking about the future with our investments. We're always looking out 3 years ahead and trying to figure out what this business that we own today will be worth, and is it worth the time and effort and capital today to invest based on that IRR. And then we almost can't wait to get to 3 years from now so we can capture those returns, and spend those returns and get the accolades from those returns. And when we live in the future like that, we're usually not spending that time taking care of today, researching, doing the maintenance due diligence, having those CEO conversations, talking to other investors that might know that company better than you, all the things that you should be doing today that actually will allow you to achieve your goals. You need to be focusing on that today. And it's also just the best way to live life, to live in the present. So I think um, when I'm doing all those things and I'm not perfect, um,
Yes.
I feel like I'm living in abundance.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. So you mentioned the word high standards. I was waiting for that. Let's go into investing. What are your non-negotiables when investing in a company? What's high standards mean for you as a company?
Well, I think that's that's evolved as my strategy has evolved. For me, so one thing that hasn't changed is just to focus on intelligent fanatics, trying to find great leadership in these small businesses because the smaller the company becomes, the more important leadership becomes. And the nice thing about that is every leader of any of these small businesses has a track record, either a public one, which you can pull up their earnings, their transcripts, interviews they've done, and see that they've done what they said or said what they've done, and you can see their track record of success or failure. Um, and so for me, it starts and almost ends with the quality level of the management team because I've seen some real high quality management teams build amazing things with mediocre assets, but I've seen a lot of mediocre management teams destroy some really good assets, and so my big focus is identifying kind of overqualified management teams that are for some reason are running this small little microcap company. And I love finding these people that, have built previously a business from 0 to 100 million or whatever it is. And you get the sense of them bringing the team back together again to do it one more time, and it doesn't mean that they're going to be successful, but at least they know what success looks like and is felt, and a lot of times they're putting their own capital and skin in the game into this new situation because they have the personal wealth to do so. They're not relying on banks or anything like that to fund their vision. They have money themselves. And so I would say 80% of what I'm looking for kind of fits that. And so when it comes to identifying these ideas, a lot of that is screening for insider purchases, large ones, and trying to find kind of that point of transformation to where here in the US, there's fewer and fewer, I would call it, real businesses going public as small companies. And so a lot of times the new ideas here in the US are simply an old business that a new management team takes over with a new strategy and something old becomes something new. And so I want to try to find it at that point of transformation where a new management team is taking over an old business and revitalizing it, perhaps even putting capital into it. And usually at that point in time, you're also buying it when the current investor base is the most annoyed and they throw in the towel right at that point of transformation too. And so you're able to buy something at a deep value price that if that new management team is successful might get a growth multiple. And that's the key to finding multi-baggers, is finding something that can grow earnings per share and have the multiple expand. And so, again, I don't bat 100%, but I think when you
Yeah.
find kind of one of these management teams that kind of fits that, your batting average goes from, let's call it 25% to 50, or, it substantially increases your likelihood of success.
There's a study that says everyone thought that the stocks that the management team has insider ownership performs better. But this is there's this study that says that that is not true. What has been your experience in that these last 20 years around management insider ownership?
I mean, I think the way I've evolved, I would say probably 10 years ago, I would call it, if it goes,
Bias, maybe.
yeah, I was biased towards management teams that, they had to have 20% ownership or some like, narrow band of ownership that was high, call it 20% or more. And now I've evolved to where I'm okay if a CEO has 1 or 2 or 3% of the business, and they can still be incentivized based on stock price or operational performance. And not every great leader is rich. This might be their first go around. Not every great leader, is a founder. It might be one of these transformations where it's actually the second in command of that business that then gets promoted up to the CEO seat, and that person has the same amount of fire in his belly as a founder does, just because he's been overlooked for the last 10 years. and he has something to prove, and he knows how to right the ship, and so that's where I've changed too, is on insider ownership in particular. I'm much more bendable on that than prior, just because I've seen a lot of successes with CEOs that, don't fit the narrative of they need to have 10% or 20% or 30% ownership.
That's good to hear
Yeah.
because I have a couple of stocks that the CEOs have like 1 or 2% of the company, and I'm used to invest in the companies that the CEO has like 20%, 30%, but that's not in every story, right? And for us, the investors outside the US, what are your advices on how we can get to know more about the company, about the management team? What has been your experience from distance with companies?
I The nice thing is about, a lot of this stuff you can just get online, and that's the beautiful thing about today, especially if it's a company that does earnings calls. I mean, you can read through all the past filings and financials and transcripts and search for the interviews they've done. Um, you can do all of this stuff, and you can, when you do that type of work, and again, everybody says, one thing I'll say, everyone says they do this work, but very few actually do it. Very few people do this every day consistently, the work
Yes.
we should be doing. And that is the edge, is really just, you know, also just going through a mountain of uninvestable ideas to find one that is. A lot of people just aren't willing to do that, and that's the edge that kind of younger, smart, astute investors that have 27 hours a day to research stocks have over a lot of other people, and that's why a lot of the greatest investors ever started down here in microcap. I mean, it's just the best place to invest because it's probably the only place in public and private markets where a small, astute investor has an advantage over institutional capital. There's three buckets of small business investing. There's microcaps, venture capital, private equity. Private equity and venture capital are now dominated by institutional capital. That
Yeah.
institutional capital loves to own businesses outright. Institutional capital does not like to own partial ownership in a small public company. They don't like it when their performance fees can be manipulated because you woke up on the wrong side of the bed and sell 100 shares of the stock and it's down 20%, and it ruins their bonus at the year end. They just hate this ecosystem. Like illiquidity is worse than no liquidity in an institution's eyes. And it's the beauty of it because they can't buy it until the stock goes up and it becomes more liquid, and so it's almost our duty as retail investors, to find these companies first and collect the reward for doing so after they go up 5 or 10x. And it's not easy, but the work that I always point to is, and you may have mentioned it on one of your shows before, is like the work by Jenga Investment Partners out of the UK. It's probably the most robust data set, just outlining over a 10-year period that's relatively recent, 2012 to 2022. 87% of all public stocks across the globe, all of them, 87% of companies that went up 1,000% or more were
Yes.
microcaps,
Yes.
and 91% of them had a history of profitability. And so if you want to find a great company early, if you want to find a multi-bagger, find something small, growing, profitable, not owned by institutions that you can gain an edge in early, form that conviction in early, so you can hold it as it executes over time. And that's the key to this. So
I share that fact everywhere.
I share it all the time. I know.
Also, remember your presentation in Las Vegas the first day. Um, I also took away the quote, uh, when you were young, smart, and poor, right?
Yeah.
I feel like that was me in that event. But yeah, it's an honor to be like to be hearing that stories and getting familiarized with the investors, right? With investors that they're professionals, they're living out of this. And I have one question that came to my mind. I hear that you, I don't know if that's correct for today, but I hear that you had 40% on one position. I don't know if that's correct for today, but somewhere in the time you had it. How do you decide how to concentrate what percentage is healthy for your mind and for your portfolio, and which company deserves that weight?
It's a good question. I mean, you could have a whole podcast just on position sizing and number
Yeah.
of positions. Um, I would say that I've always been a concentrated investor. So from the age of 21 up until I was a full-time private investor, about 10 years later, whatever that was, I was in 2 to 4 stocks, so I'm used to kind of
Wow.
heavy concentration, and I have to watch when I say that because I don't mean that that's right for everybody else. It was just right for me. It fit my temperament. You can win in this game a lot of different ways. It doesn't have to be my way. It's what makes investing great.
Yeah.
So I'm used to having kind of larger positions. Now that I manage more personal capital, now that I have a fund, we have, I would say, a dozen positions, so 12, and the top five make up close to 70%, which again, most people would say that's insanely concentrated, but for me, it feels like it's overly diversified, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to kind of large positions, and one of the things that I'm still learning this to this day, but one of the areas I've evolved is I used to take 20-25% at cost positions, in these companies. And I've realized
Mm.
over time, a lot of time, that it just isn't necessary because we're investing in these microcaps because we want to make outsized returns, not because we think we can make 12.2% return every year. Um,
Yes.
and so I would say over the last 7-8 years, bringing that at cost percentage down to more like 5 to 8% at cost, allowing that position to build its way to a 20%, 30% position or more. But it needs to go up to get there. It's not going to get there from me continuing to add capital to it, add capital to it, add capital to it. It's going to go up by earning its right to that position size. And I found that when let's just say a 30% position becomes a 30% position because it went up 500%, it's easier to sleep at night with that position than it is with a position that you just made something 30% and you keep on averaging down in it like day after day, trying to prove to the market that you're right by putting more capital into it. That's when you lose sleep at night. And that's when I lose sleep at night.
Yeah.
But I think the position sizing question is going to be like everything with investing. It's going to be like a fingerprint. We're all different, and so what's comfortable for you is gonna be uncomfortable for somebody else. And for me, I'm okay holding 30% positions. Sometimes they get even as high as 40. But I would say my normal largest positions are in that kind of 20 to 25% band, but it's only because they've gone up 3 or 400% to get there.
Thank you for sharing. I feel the
And
same. I mean,
last point for
yeah,
this,
yeah,
and the
sure.
way I protect myself is I'm always living in the present with that position, always looking today where that business is valued and where I think it's going to be in 3 years. And if I still feel like there's optimal upside over the next 3 years, I'll continue to hold it. And I'm always comparing that against every other position in the portfolio and my watch list of companies. So if my expected IRR in that 25% position is still better than everything else I own, I'm not going to sell it. And if it isn't as good as something else I own, I'm going to sell a little bit and buy something else, the thing that has a higher expected IRR. And so that's how I kind of gauge when I'm going to be selling, what I'm going to be adding to, is just trying to have a real clear snapshot almost every day on what my expected IRR is for each position that I own, compare them across the board, and make changes accordingly.
Thank you, Ian. Uh, I feel the same. I mean, I have found that the limit of the weight I can have in a company is around 20-25%. Over that, I don't sleep well and I need to sleep well. I need to be healthy. Okay, we're gonna leave the last minutes to the questions I got from the community. But before that, I want to ask you one more questions that I prepared. It's what would you say is the main difference between investing in microcap versus large cap?
I would say the main difference is your hold time will probably be shorter. I think in today's day and age, everyone is falling in love with this buy and hold forever mantra that
Yes.
that is put out there. It's sort of, if you're not buying and holding something, or for 30 years, you're doing it wrong. And I just think that has kind of overswept the whole investment community way too much, and overshadows the reality of not only microcap, but large cap too. Each business you own is going to have a different shelf life to it. And
Yes.
the smaller the company becomes, that shelf life just naturally becomes shorter, and so a successful microcap portfolio will have turnover to it, there, and it's just part of the game. And so like my portfolio has a significant amount of turnover,
Yeah.
and
Sorry,
even
sorry
even
to.
my winners are probably, I mean, my average hold time is probably a year and a half across the portfolio. It doesn't mean that I'm selling everything every year and a half. I'm selling some things within months, some things within quarters, and I still hold things for 12 years, But the reality is that a lot of these companies have success, and it's a season of success. And a lot of us want to believe a business is better than what it is, but that a lot of these businesses are more cyclical than what we think, and
Yeah.
it looks more like 2 to 4 quarters of success, and then they stub their toe, and some of them don't ever come back again, and so you just have to live in that reality of, with smaller microcap companies, turnover is going to be part of the strategy, which means maintenance, due diligence, and staying on top of the businesses the best you can is really important. You can't coffee can these positions under your bed and wake up in 20 years and expect it to, go up 50,000%. You'll be broke if you do that. You got to stay on top of these positions. So
I feel like this coffee can philosophy of investing is kind of overrated because if you go to the early days of Warren Buffett, Peter Lynch, their turnover rate is really high. It's 200%, 300%. I think you guys have a blog of
yes,
that in the club, right? Yeah, I read it like 5 years ago. It's really good. I'll share it with the community here in the comments so they can reach it. You also have the link for the MicroCap Club community and for everything we are talking about here in the interview. Also, you guys have the presentation Ian made in the Las Vegas event last week because I saw that you publicly shared it today, right? This
yes,
morning.
yeah, yep,
Perfect, perfect. They're gonna have it as well, so they can get that. Okay, let's go to the questions the community share with me.
sure.
The first one is its valuation. Most people do not invest in microcaps because they don't know how to evaluate these companies because they're used to P ratio, discounted cash flow, but the accounting of the microcaps is very different. What valuation metrics do you use?
It really does change depending on the industry you're invested in. There is no like set, unfortunately, there is no set kind of valuation metric. It depends on what types of businesses you're looking at and what sectors you're looking at them. We might be looking at um, a consumer goods company that sells snack bars or something like that. And when you look at what metric you should be looking at with those, it's usually like an enterprise value to sales. When you're looking at other ones, it might be enterprise value to EBITDA, and another one that might be something, might just be book value, and so it really depends on the area that you're investing in. For
Yeah.
me, when it comes to valuation, I like to invest at a low valuation because that is, if I can find something that is towards the lower end of valuation in that sector, that is growing double digits, that doesn't need to raise capital, then my expected IRR or return should match the organic growth rate of that business. And so I'm primarily trying to find these kind of companies that are trading at low valuation that can sustain a 20%, 30%, maybe even more organic growth rate that I'm getting in at a good valuation to where I know kind of my worst case scenario is I'm going to make 20 to 30%, whatever their organic growth rate is. Then
Yeah.
God forbid they get multiple expansion. And that's when the IRR just supercharges from 20% to 50, if the multiple doubles at the same time over the next 3 years. And that's usually what happens if you get them right. Um,
Usually in this microcaps company, you don't get the moats, the competitive advantage that Google has, Nvidia has. How do you deal with that as well?
it's a yeah, I mean the nice thing is a lot of these companies that you find and dive into, they dominate kind of these small niches, that are kind of under the radar. And I've always been drawn to that, for the last 10 years, is these companies that are very unique. They're one of one businesses and they dominate kind of a small niche area that's expanding, that's allowing them to grow 20% a year. And their success with that narrow, call it TAM,
Yeah.
pulls them into a larger one where their customers are underserved. And then they ultimately, that's how they get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And it's not rocket science. I mean, that's usually how any company starts and finishes. The success stories. They start somewhere small, dominate it, and let their success pull them into greater things.
Good, good. Okay, the last questions. With the last question we got from the community, it's about where do you where your ideas comes from. Talk us about the MicroCap Club, the network that you have.
Yeah. So, MicroCap Club, I founded that 2 years after I became a full-time private investor. I just wanted to see what other investors, what other smart investors in this niche investing, what they liked and why. And so kind of looked at what Value Investors Club was doing and some other communities were doing and just focused it in on microcaps. And yeah, today, I mean, for the first 3 or 4 years of MicroCap Club's existence, it was just me talking to myself. But over time, it attracted
Yeah.
investors into it. And, now almost 15 years later, it's a pretty robust, small, active community. And it's unique mainly because it's free to become a member. All you
Yep.
have to do is submit an investment thesis on your favorite microcap stock. And our membership votes on that thesis at the end of every month. If you get in, you get in. If you don't, you don't. You can also just pay to subscribe, and that gets you access, and you're able to post as well. But that's what makes us unique. And I always wanted it to be free because I always wanted to be able to attract the young, smart, and poor. Because it's actually the young, the young, smart, and poor that find these ideas first. Because again, you're the ones that have 27 hours a day to research stocks. You find them before institutions do. So that's why there's no paywall
Yeah.
up for people to become a member, and there never will be. And it's kind of our ethos, and it's also kind of our differentiator of our community versus anyone else that just has a paywall up everywhere, to gain access to whatever they're doing. And I think it's what kind of makes us unique. So I would say probably 20 to 30% of my ideas originate, maybe 50% of the ideas originate out of the club. And that's a
Okay.
combination of the ideas that are profiled every month, where we normally have 10 to 20 new ideas posted every month on the community.
Yes.
And it's a combination of that and just the networking I do within the community and people that I've met over time within MicroCap Club. And for me, that last part of networking and building out your network is just huge. I don't think there's a better place, and I don't even use it as effectively as I should, but on the clubs, like just the amount of a number of high quality investors that are on there. If you devoted yourself to building out a network, you could do so pretty quickly on there. and going to the events, then meeting people physically. I mean, it's just so much fun. And my
Yes.
my advantage today is my network over anything, and that's Warren Buffett's advantage. He's the best investor ever because yeah, he started early and he's right more than he's not, but it's also his network. Like he can get to the truth quicker than anybody else. And that's really the key in investing is like your ability to get and find the truth quicker than somebody else. And so your network is crucial for that.
Yes. I've been in the club from 3 years now, and it's crazy how every month you got 50 names, 20 names, and I have 11 stocks on my portfolio. Two have came from the club because I got to know them in the MicroCap Club. So yes, and last week I was in Vegas speaking with the investors, with the companies. I got like 20 more names to research. So it's very, very helpful, specifically in this world, because you don't see these companies on the news. You don't see these companies on the, I don't know, in X, in Twitter. You don't see these companies in YouTube either. You have to go really deep in the internet if you want to find these ideas,
Yeah.
and getting in these clubs and in the events, it's quicker. It's quicker, right? Um, Thank you, Ian. Last two questions. First, which lesson of life have you learned in the last month? Not investing, a life lesson that you want to share with us.
Um, I would say, it really gets back to the article I just wrote. That's something I was thinking about a lot. I wrote it probably the first three quarters of it on the flight out to Las Vegas, and just reflecting on, my family, how I'm perceived, am I kind of raising the standard for the family as well as my portfolio. My grandmother just passed away a few days ago, so just reflecting on her life and um, just the impact that she's had, and just thinking about life more as from a from an impact perspective rather than how much I can take out of it. And so that's something I've been thinking about more and more.
Good, good lesson. And last question, if the people want to know more about microcaps, excluding your books that you have co-author and you have the forward in Free Capital and the microcap cup and your blog, where else they can get to know about more about microcaps?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there's more and more microcap investors that are popping up, and you can find them on X, and they have Substacks, and you can find ideas there as well. I think one of the really good resources that we have that's free is on how to research a microcap stock, that is on our YouTube channel that's out there free of charge. It's like an hour long video of me and Michael Liu talking about the research process and the differences between researching a microcap and a large cap.
Yeah.
Um, I would point people, to that as well. And just last thing, I mean, you're not going to be perfect when you start microcap investing. I learned by losing, and if you don't give up, you end up winning. And you just learn by just going out and doing it. There's only so much you can read and watch. Don't be afraid to get out there and just invest a little bit, and know that any loss that you take is a tuition bill. And you're going to learn from it, and you're going to excel if you just stick with it. And that's what I did. That's what a lot of other people are doing too.
Perfect. No, thank you, Ian. I want to finish this interview saying thank you for your time and for signing my book. You wrote Crush It. I'm gonna crush it, of course. Um, thank you, and hopefully we can have you in another, maybe in 6 months, maybe 1 year, to speak about more technicality of investing. But for everyone, please go to the MicroCap Club channel. Please read the MicroCap blog. It's very, very valuable. I have learned a lot there. So thank you, Ian, for your time. Hope you had fun.
Thank you. Now, this is a blast. Look forward to coming on again. Thank you.